Hello and welcome to Transformation Teaching's Koan of Illness interview series. A koan is an essentially unsolvable puzzle that leads spiritual aspirants to a deeper reality. Chronic illness is a koan, and it too has the potential to lead us to deeper understandings. In this series, we're bringing you the voices of people who can lead us into deeper perspectives and shed their light on this koan of illness. Any questions you might have about the interview or the topic, you can write to me at lynn@transformationteaching.com. And today we're going to be talking with John Dupuy. John Dupuy, MA, is the founder and CEO of Integral Recovery, a revolutionary approach to the treatment of addiction and alcoholism. He has over 2 decades experience working with addicts and their families and travels internationally to teach and inspire on the subjects of integral recovery, integral practice, and the use of brainwave entrainment technology to deepen one's meditation practice and in the treatment of addiction, depression, and PTSD. John is also co-founder and CEO of iAwake Technologies, a company that produces audio tracks with cutting-edge sound technologies to enhance meditation, peak performance, flow state, sleep patterns, and healing emotions. John is an engaging, open, honest, and humorous speaker, which I can attest to, and author of the award-winning book, Integral Recovery, a revolutionary approach to the treatment of alcoholism and addiction. He also hosts the online series, Spiritual Tech Talks 2.0, in which he converses with pioneers of emerging spiritual technologies and co-hosts the popular podcast, Journey of Integral Recovery. John is an avid meditator, fitness enthusiast, and has a passion for singing and playing the electric blues. So fabulous, John. I'm really, really excited that you're here today. On rereading your wonderful book, which I did over the weekend, I saw that what you're doing for the addiction community is really what I hope to do for the chronic illness community in general. And I include addiction and mental illness within that community, which is to use the integral map to bring healing in multiple dimensions. And you're one of the people I know who is most able to describe this map in some straightforward terms that will make sense to our listeners. So I wonder if we could just dive in and start talking about the map, how you use it, what your experience with it has been, however you want to frame that. That'd be great.
Well, yeah, when thinking about what you're doing, of course, addiction is a chronic condition. And what happens when you get into recovery or integral recovery, it's like, in AA, it's like, hello, my name is John, I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict or whatever the issue is. And that's kind of where you stay. And you kind of like, and that's partially true, but using the developmental maps and the developmental trajectory of human development and evolution, we know that when you are, or this is the way I frame it anyway, is that when you're in the throes of addiction and you're being controlled by your addiction, you're drinking every day, you're losing control, it's getting worse and worse, you know it's bad, but you can't stop, you're powerless over it. It's really accurate to say, I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict, whatever your drugs of choice are. Then once you get into recovery, it's like, Keegan from Harvard said that your last developmental level becomes the object rather than the subject of the next level. So your I'm an addict becomes I have an addiction. No, in other words, it's accounted for, but it's no longer the main controlling force of my life. So we've actually transcended it, where it's not this huge thing, this demon, if you will, this disease that's completely taking over and destroying our lives. It's something that's come down to a much more manageable and not earth-shaking level. Just like with PTSD, initially, it's really, really hard, and when it comes back up, it's just this somatic, very powerful experience that you're dealing with, like surround sound and somatically and all this stuff. It's terrifying, but with time and work and releasing and all the things that go into healing from PTSD, it becomes more like a black and white picture that's stored, up there on the shelf that you're still aware of in this, but it's no longer this, thing that's driving to these really horribly painful and dysfunctional states. And let me say, just to make this a little more personal, it'll be 3 months and a week on tomorrow, Wednesday, that I had a massive heart attack. So I was driving back to Texas from Louisiana with my dog, and I was coming out of the gym in the morning. I just finished working out, and in the parking lot, I had this massive heart attack, and my left ventricle artery had closed down 100%. So I barely made it back to the hotel because I wanted to make sure my dog was taken care of.
So you actually drove yourself back to the hotel?
3.8 miles. And I'm having a heart attack, and I look in the mirror, and I'm completely white, white as snow. And I get back, and anyway, I collapse and call 911. The ambulance comes, and the miracle is I'd been on this 1,600-mile drive. I was a couple hundred miles away from where I live, and there was the St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction, Colorado, was like a mile away. So they actually had the angioplastic technology that was able to go in through an artery and open up the collapsed artery to save my life. If I'd been anywhere else, most, hospitals, especially in the little towns and places that I was traveling through, don't have those kind of facilities. So it was extremely serendipitous that I was there. All that to say, I have been in the process of recovering from this massive heart attack, which adds a little more, first person experience to the subject that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, you can see how that map applies in first person, not necessarily to addiction, but to illness in general. This is our subject today. So so I'm happy if you can talk about using the map for addiction, but also how you maybe used it for yourself and how others.
Yeah, well, path as pathology as path, is a good way to frame that. So whether it's addiction, I also suffered from depression. I've given a lot of good stuff to work on using this model. And, at first it was really strange. After they opened the valve back up, immediately I felt relief, and I went back, they put me in emergency care, and I had like 5 hours of extreme spiritual and mental clarity. It's like, and sometimes you hear right before people die, they get really clear. And I thought, I'm wondering if I'm, getting ready to check out here. And if I was, it's a great way to go. But I didn't. But after about 5 hours, I felt like a man who just had a massive heart attack. Very tired and could barely walk. And of course, God bless the hospitals, they saved my life. But man, it's not a place I want to be. With all these probes and IVs and this bed that must have cost $75,000. That was the most uncomfortable bed I've ever been in. I mean, it does all kinds of things except be comfortable. Anyway, keep working on it, guys. So, so after 3 days, they let me out, and I was very, very weak. Pam flew in from Louisiana, where we were helping take care and be with her aging mother. I spent a lot of time the last few years doing that work with my parents and now her mom, and she got there and she drove me back, and then just started this, and immediately I began to, I even was meditating in the hospital, but I kept up with the practices. And one of the things that happens when one has a chronic disease is that one often gets really depressed, and really despair and, angry, and why me and this and that. And I no longer have any gifts to give. And, so, I've been practicing, maybe 12, doing this deep meditation almost on a daily basis for about 12 or 13 years now. So I had a real foundation of practice that helped me. And the doctor said because I was in good shape, that probably allowed me to get to the hotel. And of course, everybody in retrospect says, you idiot, you should have called in the parking lot and gotten people to take care of your dog. And it's like, oh yeah, duh. But, one of the, I take comfort in a saying allegedly by Abraham Lincoln. He said, don't tell me about your religion. Show me how you take care of your dog. So if that is something to judge spirituality, but I'm doing pretty good in that particular capacity. So it was, first thought was not about my life. It was about making sure that Lucy wasn't abandoned.
I had a similar experience. I drove myself to the hospital after my water broke, because I wanted to get back in time to pick up my son from nursery school. Or maybe the priorities get a
Oh
little.
my goodness. Yeah. So we got to learn some self-care there. But and the people in the hotel I'd introduced them to Lucy the night before, the woman that was kind of running things. She was a dog lover, so they took care of her until my friend Eric Wildbear from Salt Lake City arrived, and he was the first person on the scene to be with me, and then took care of Lucy. So it all worked out. There was a lot of love and support. But I started having to deal with that stuff, and I in the first couple of weeks, and I wasn't supposed to do a lot of exercise because this sheath that they put in you to open up your this valve, and they put a stent in there to keep it open. It goes through an artery down by your groin, so they don't want you to open it up and bleed out. So you're supposed to take it. Not that I was exactly feeling like jumping up and down and doing strenuous exercise, but the meditation kept on. In fact, I started meditating more. And of course, I'm the CEO of iAwake Technologies, as I think you said in the bio. So I'm like, Willy Wonka in the meditation chocolate factory. I have all these great tools that I'm very familiar with and that we keep developing. So that was a tremendous help. And I had moments of really deep, spiritual grace in those first couple of weeks. And I was actually weeping with gratitude for the whole thing, because I saw how it was helping me shift things in my life, and issues that I was working on just got cleared up to a much larger extent than they were. And, I started going to the gym, and, it's just, okay, you're kind of scared because after you have a heart attack, you feel your heart all the time. There's this hyper awareness of your heart. So every little creak and ache and flutter, you feel it. And it's a great mindfulness thing for the pump, and you feel it. So, but I started, it's what I do. I practice. And I really upped the meditation practice, and I started doing a Qigong, which is kind of like a Tai Chi, a slow, subtle energy practice that I'd done before, years before. It really helped with my depression at that point. And so, I put on some of our subtle energy tracks from iAwake and be doing Qigong. And I found masters on YouTube where we find everything. So, got this big, 65-inch monstrous television screen. So it's like, I'm in the room with these people doing it, and that helped. And the other thing that was very interesting, I had several spells where I would get dizzy and my hands would get cold and sweat and all this tingly stuff. And I was like, wow, am I having a heart attack again? And I went to the clinic, and my blood pressure would go way up. And basically, when we talked to the cardiologist, he said that, well, that's PTSD.
Oh,
PTSD. And I got really happy, weirdly enough, because, now I've experienced it, and I know so many of our brothers and sisters that suffer from that, not to mention all the people that are coming back from our endless wars that we're currently engaged in, all these young people and maybe not so young people suffering from this. And of course, I had stuff before, but the way my body had reacted to it, I'd gone into depression. So this time I had depression plus PTSD. Awesome. What an opportunity to practice, right?
Well, it's a heart attack. Oh my God.
Yeah. Serious as a heart attack, literally. So, so when I understood that, it gave me a deeper understanding of PTSD. There's one thing about, reading about something and talking to people. And the other thing is when you experience it, and it's really somatic. It's much more somatic than it was, thought-based. So, your mind starts kind of flipping out because, your body's flipping out. But it was like my body was really freaked out by what had happened, and of course, I guess I have a pretty good attitude about it, and acceptance of death if it's my time. When I was in the emergency room and they were getting ready to perform the procedure, I had this kind of vision. I never went unconscious of. I was teaching this class at Cordington College in Barbados, and I'd been teaching it online for almost about 11 weeks at that point. And I had a great class on the road. I taught it from the motel room I was staying in, and I saw the faces of all my students. We use Zoom. And I was like, well, there they are, my angels, these beautiful students that I've been working with, and we had a great class. And I said, if this is it, then that's not a bad little, punctuation mark if you will, on the story of my life, my human life here. So I was kind of at peace with that, and I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but yeah. So I started practicing at PTSD. Depression would come on. I was really familiar with depression. So, you wake up and it's like, okay, you're, all this, your physical fitness and all this stuff and all your practice and blah, blah, blah. Now your heart's giving out. You're really messed up, internally, externally, right quadrant, left quadrants, all this, and you have nothing to give, and the world is really screwed up, and you have nothing left to give. And that was like, okay, this is depression. I know this voice well. So I would go and I'd meditate for like a couple of hours or more. And, and when I'm working with depression and this darkness, it just, when I go through it, I go through it. In other words, it intensifies, and the suffering, and of course, if the many years as I've been meditating, I can kind of, see it from the outside and from the inside simultaneously. And I have enough faith in the process now that I know that by intensifying, it means I'm going through it. And the only way out of this darkness and suffering is through it. You can't avoid it, or you can, but it's just a disaster. In other words, if you just use pain medications, which are addictive and have all kinds of other issues, you're going to have problems. So you really have to deal with it that way. And I would come through, and when I would come through the depression, the darkness, it's like, it doesn't just go, bam, the light's on. It's like a fog lifting. It's like, first it's like, okay, all right. And I know the process pretty well now, but in the beginning it's like, no, you just want it to be gone. So you're imagining like a false dawn, but then it begins to emerge, and it's like, oh, okay. And then it does lift. And when you're through it, you feel at peace, you feel gratitude, you feel connected to spirit, to God, higher power, however you want to say that. And you feel okay. So you feel really good. And so that becomes, just more of the whole thing, the process of becoming a focus of practice. And I play tennis a lot too, which I really love. And I'd go out there with my wife, and, we bang it out. We're very competitive, and it's pretty fun to watch the egos dance around. Anyway, and so I would just like hit the ball back and forth, a few times, and that was it. I'd be tired, or if you're not going boom, boom. But later, now I'm back after 3 months. We're playing whole sets, and
wow, fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm working out pretty much maybe 90% of what I was doing before, and yeah, so. Oh, and I just got back a week ago from a 3-week trip to Barbados, and then I went to Ireland, and then I went to Hungary for the Integral European Conference. And, it's like when I delivered my main talk on the main stage there, it had been exactly 3 months since his heart attack. And people were like, wow. And what are you doing here? And I called the doctor, and I did the stress test, and I'll shut up after this. But about 6 weeks afterwards, I went back to Colorado, to Grand Junction, and went back to the hospital. And you have a heart attack, like the stress test afterwards is all important, because as severe as my heart attack, it can permanently damage your heart, and it can be all kinds of issues, and they may have to do another procedure. So anyway, I was kind of like, oh dear. Lucy, my wife Pam, and I drove back, and I got up early in the morning by myself. Lucy and Pam were still, sleeping, and drove to the hospital. I'm going, the hospital again. And it's kind of like a dread. So I got into the waiting room at the stress test center or whatever it was, and I put on my headphones and I crossed my legs and I just start meditating. And finally, about 20 minutes later, they come get me, and they take me into it's huge. It looks like kind of a CAT scan, huge X-ray machine. It takes like 20 minutes to take a picture of your heart. Plus, they stuck an IV and they pumped some radioactive stuff into me so they could watch my heart. So if I have a glowing countenance, it may not be my spiritual attainment, but it may be the radioactive isotopes I still have floating around. Anyway, that's kind of a joke. So, yeah, so they allowed me to keep meditating this whole time. And so then after that, they took me on the stress machine, and, they hooked me up with all this stuff, and I started cranking it, and they wanted to get my heart up right to 135. And then I got there, and I was just getting started. It felt great to sweat and to work out. And they said, well, you want me to go more? I said, yeah, if you can. So they cranked it up a little higher, the level, and I just kept going and going. They said, okay, it's good because, you know, the longer you do it and the higher you get your heart rate, the better data, the more data they have. So they said, okay, that's enough. We've never really had anybody quite so enthusiastic. So then they put me back on the X-ray machines, because then they need to take 2 pictures, another 40 minutes. And by that time, you know, I've been listening to iAwake. You know, I was about 2 hours and 40 minutes into this brain entrainment, meditate while you get, you know, medically tested. And I was having like a class 5 mystical experience at that point. I was just feeling God presence and everything. And I was just like in a state of real deep connectivity and joy and peace and love. And I remember thinking, like, is this going to be like a false positive? My heart's so happy right now. You know, they're going to see this glowing. Yeah. So anyway, the women, the nurses, really, really sweet, who did the stress test, said, you know, all the stuff that you were doing, you look great. This data we have, but as far as the pictures and stuff, the doctor will have to get back to you. So a couple of days later, they called back and said, it looks great. Looks really good. So I said, well, I got this in a week. I'm supposed to go on this 3-week, you know, extravaganza of a trip. And they said, no, go for it. So I felt I should, and I did, but there was still a little consternation and fear because, you know, you don't quite know. For those of us who haven't had heart attacks, you just kind of take it for granted. Your heart keeps ticking, you know, and everything works. And so anyway, I went, and it worked out really well. And the place we were staying is in Hungary, and there's like 1,000 places in Hungary where hot water comes out of the ground. So they have these health spots all over the place. So the hotel was there. So I'd work out and do saunas, get in the ice water, and then, you know, and do this, the hot waters every day. And I think that was really, really good for me. And we're not such a spa oriented culture, you know, or Kurort, or a healing place, as they say in Germany, as they are in many places in Europe. But if that's a really nice thing to do if you can, if you're dealing with different afflictions.
Wow. Well, you sound like a perfect textbook example of your own work, you know, reading. I'd like to go back, if we could, and sort of, sure. You touched on all of the different quadrants. And just to give people an idea of what I'm going to be talking about here and relating to. Integral theory, developed largely by Ken Wilber, has one model which shows 4 quadrants in which we can look at ourselves. And those involve the interior self and the exterior. And we've certainly heard you talk about the exterior physical aspect of what you've been doing. And then the interior, the spiritual experience, the way you felt about it, your emotions. And then you have, in this quadrant system, you also have the individual experience, which was yours, and then the collective, working, you know, with the hospital, being involved in a system, and with your wife in a relationship. So you touched on all of these 4 different areas: the internal self, what was going on in your own mind, your physical body, behavior, activity. You've touched on your relationships, and you've touched with your students, with your wife, and you've touched on your experience with the medical system. Yes. And I know that in your book, in dealing with addiction, with your addiction clients, that you take them through these 4 quadrants and have them look at each one of these aspects of their lives. And it seems to me like you, of course, probably naturally, not so formally, because it's so much a part of you. But I wonder if you could take your experience and speak about it in terms of those quadrants and how they work for you.
Yeah, well, you know, prior to the heart attack, I'd lost 30 pounds. I just like, wait a second, you know. So I'd worked on that, which was good. And of course, I had a physical, and we were dieting. We were doing the keto diet, and then I kind of, you know, changed that. I said, I can do this, but if I can't have fruit, I'm going to go nuts. And so I started adding fruit with either, you know, putting lots of lemon juice or apple cider vinegar. And added that, and I continued to lose weight. So it didn't hurt it. So you have to kind of tweak these things. So yeah, so I had the practices that I was doing prior to it, and there was no history of heart disease in my family, by the way. Well, there is now, but there wasn't. So, and of course the interior, because I'm a long-term meditator, and the technology that we use, in other words, it helps people to develop a really transformative practice really quickly. Okay, and traditional meditation can often take a long time. Ken Wilber said it took him 5 years of meditating 2 hours a day before he really started feeling any results. That feels almost incomprehensible. But then again, that man does things that I find incomprehensible. So I'll just have to take him at that, his word. And I could have never stuck with it. In fact, I was an off again, gone again meditator for years. I knew it was something I'd do, but it just, in our lives, and I didn't want to live in a monastery and blah, blah. I didn't want to join a cult or, do that kind of thing. Or, I have a history that makes, spiritual teachers with a capital T, I run out of the building quickly. So I often quip that I prefer my spiritual teachers dead. I read their books. It's easier that way. So anyway, that's a whole another story. So so I kept on, and thank God I had practices of dealing with shadow and dealing with trauma and dealing with depression, and knew the efficacy and how to use the technology in skillful ways. It's not just enough to have the technology, but you need to know how to use it, and worked on that for a long time. In the lower left, thank God I had so much support. My wife, after taking care of her mom and blah, 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 she had to take care of me, and poor thing. Anyway, she was very supportive. My friends were very supportive in our list, the people that we, deal with in integral recovery and iAwake. Anyway, I sent out an email letting people know what was going on. I had tremendous support there. So, and I tend to be, believe it or not the way I present, but in my own space, I'm pretty much of a introvert, and I tend to spend a lot of time alone. So the lower left, when I actually utilize it, the we space is really a breakthrough for me. Carl Jung said that God will also often come through the rejected quadrant, or the rejected part. So the one that we're most uncomfortable in was the ones that will actually have some of our biggest breakthroughs. So that's really important. You need to have support. You're not supposed to do this stuff alone. And the time to start working on it is before you get ill. Is establishing friendships and relationships and paying attention to that. And I left home when I was 14, and I traveled, lived in Latin America and Europe and all of the U.S. And so I would just, make friends and then move on. It wasn't until I guess I was in my mid-30s that I thought, gosh, where are my friends? I keep moving on all the time. And the one thing you knew you don't get is old friends. And so you really have to cultivate relationships, because it's really important. I think William Glasser wrote a book. I forget the name of it, but he said that he was instrumental in a lot of the stuff that we developed for our wilderness therapy and earlier in my career. And he said there's maybe a handful or two fingers full of relationships in your life, and how you negotiate those relationships will largely determine if you have a successful and happy life. So your children, your parents, your significant other, your spouse, your best friends. And so I've paid more attention to that. And of course, we live in the age of the internet. So I have, friends that I'm very close to that live in Africa and Europe and different parts of the world. And we can connect like this. And in very deep ways. I mean, obviously being physically together, in the same, space-time continuum is really, really good. But we have ways of connecting with others and ourselves. I mean, this interview or this conversation is an example of that. And so that became very, very important. And of course, thank God, I have this beautiful place to live. I live in southern Utah, and in this county that has a little over 2,000 people in it and about 2,500 square miles of wilderness. So we got a lot of space. There's no stoplights. It's a very, very beautiful area. So I was just thinking how harder for me would have been to do this recovery work in the city. I love the spaciousness and the quiet. And of course we have internet that works. So it allows us to do our work and stay connected otherwise. And, we had insurance that actually paid for the stuff, which is really good. You never know. I mean, whether they'll try to find some excuse to wiggle out of it or something. These guys didn't.
Yeah.
And really it's called Liberty Insurance, by the way. And it's kind of a more whole, I'll give them a plug because they did what they're supposed to do. You know, I'm always bagging on insurance, saying that the way that they make money is by not paying for anything, you know, but these guys seem to be really legitimate, and it's kind of more holistic. Anyway, it's kind of a progressive green type of insurance policy, but that super helped. And having a relationship and having this place to heal, and you know, have a little gym down the street, which I always kind of bagged on and thought being great until the gym I worked out at the hotel in Hungary. Oh my God, what a wimpy gym. Anyway, so maybe you appreciate, you know, what I have. So yeah, so all of those 4 dimensions, you know, those 4 quadrants were just essential dimensions of reality that have to be accounted for in everything. Whether you're recovering from a disease, or you're dealing with a chronic condition, or you're building a company, or you're starting a baseball team, or you're going to get married, or whatever it is, if you neglect that, it's just not going to work. So you can be totally in love in the we space and blah, 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 but you don't do anything about the lower right, like having a job, having a money, having a place to live and all that stuff. That's going to cause so much stress on the we space, and in your upper left and your physical, that the whole thing is going to collapse. Okay. So you can't reduce any of these quadrants to the other quadrant. For example, in your upper right quadrant, which is your physical body, in the case dealing with a human being, if you want to study people that are experiencing falling in love or being in love, you can hook them up, you know, and show them a picture, or have their partner there present in the room. They're going to feel these wonderful feelings, and you're going to see things in the brain that, you know, these parts firing, you know, these chemical levels are doing this, and you compare a bunch of people who are having the same type of experience, and you're going to see commonalities. When people fall in love, this is what the brain does. That is essential, really, really interesting information, but it tells you nothing about the inner experience of being in love. So you got to listen to Beatles songs, or sonnets of Shakespeare, or, you know, chick flicks, or what. You know, it's a bummer to say romantic movies or chick flicks, but anyway. So you have to get that phenomenological, have experienced it, and listen to the poets and listen to others and share. So you can't reduce, although some scientists would like to, just reduce everything to chemicals and what the brain does under certain conditions. But you also have to have the interior experience.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that comes up in chronic illness very often, is the look at the medical system, which is all focused on that right side, upper right quadrant, what's going on with your body, what do the tests show, whereas the person comes in with a whole inner experience, like you described. You know, I'm worried, and what do I do, and am I dying, and, you know, what does this experience mean, what does it mean if I feel my heart, and all of those are these interior questions that go on with us, and they're often just not addressed by the medical system.
No, God help us. You know, our medical system is really screwed up. Now, it's done, saved my life. So you say you ingrate. Well, it's true. I mean, some of the things it does really well. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. So deep bow, thank you very much. But in other areas, such as the interiors of the patients, you know, they may have a counselor or something like that, but they don't really get that. And not only that, not only do you have to pay attention to the interiors of the patient, how about the interiors of the healthcare providers, the doctors, and the nurses? And if you occasionally you'll find a doctor who just has a wonderful manner with his patient, has a really big heart, and, you know, and a really smart brain, you'll see their waiting rooms are packed to overflowing because people are looking for that. But in medical training, there's no interior, there's no meditation practice, no deep prayer practice, no contemplative interior training about how to deal with this stuff. And so it becomes really out of balance. And then, of course, people have to go other places to find that kind of help, whether your temple, your church, you know, your sangha, or just, you know, kind of doing it on your own and reading books and blah, 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 like I've kind of done. But yeah, it's really pathetic. And we need to, while we total honor, you know, Western medicine and hard science, and I read somewhere that antibiotics, I know everybody kind of freaks out about antibiotics because they have the issues also, but they show you in the first world, in the West, that antibiotics have guaranteed on average 30 more years of life than if we didn't have them.
Yeah, amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So we need every quadrant. I think people sometimes have a tendency to throw that out. Allopathic medicine, oh, it's terrible and it's got all its problems and it has its problems, but as you point out, it is phenomenal as well. So we need each of those. We can't drop one for the other. You can't say, well, I'll just do all my internal healing and my heart attack will go away, because no, it won't.
It won't. No. And yeah, and yeah, it's instead of this or that, it's a yes and yes and yes and.
Mm-hmm.
That we keep bringing these things together and see how they work. And the whole integral model too is very evolutionary. In other words, the more that we work with it, the better it gets. I mean, it's not the 10 Commandments written, the finger of God and tablets of stone that, oh, yea, verily never change, but it's I say in the introduction of my book, this is not the last word on integral recovery. It's the first word, because it's made to change and evolve. And as we begin to work in all these quadrants and put it together for the first time really in human history, we have this capacity to be whole human beings in a deep, deep sense of the word that just hasn't been done before. And some of the early schools of yoga were definitely trying to be more integral and conclude all these parts, but they didn't know the things we know now about the human brain and so many, that we've learned in the last century or two. It's just changed, the story of what it means to be alive and be a human. So that's very encouraging stuff.
Yeah, I think it is. I think just knowing about the quadrants, just knowing that there are all these aspects to oneself and to one's experience,
Sure.
It just enlarges you. It makes, for me, applying it to, I'm a caregiver, and that's been my primary experience with illness for the last 32 years. And just realizing I have to take care of something in each one of these areas. There's no point in focusing solely on one and letting all the others go, because they all influence each other. So
Right.
if there's a medication that you're asked to take in the upper right quadrant as part of your physical self, but for some reason you have maybe religious problems with it or some other kind of issue, it's not going to matter that it's there. You have to take both into account. And ideally, our medical system will begin to incorporate more of that. And we have integrative medicine, which is not the same thing as,
but it's a step in the right direction.
but
Definitely.
it is a step in the right direction. I think people are beginning to get it. And I'm glad you brought up the point of the interior of the healthcare provider, because they too are caught in this system. They're having to deal with the administrative system that they're working in and the expectations and the financial situation. They're dealing with patients who they don't have enough time to spend with, even if they might want to have a better bedside manner and more time. They're caught up in this as well. And so the more that the system actually takes into account these four quadrants and sees them as important, I think it will release everybody in the picture to have a better experience, a better opportunity to help, more healing in every dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm currently writing my second book, and it's called the working title, The Life of Practice, Taking Evolution Personally. So it became very clear when I was writing or working with addicts that it's not only the addict or the identified patient that's suffering and has issues. I mean, everybody involved with this person is suffering and has issues. And the same practices that we were recommending for addicts is good for everyone else, because we all have issues, whether it's addiction or depression, or, we had, painful childhoods and we have a lot of PTSD and unprocessed things, or we haven't reached one of the great tragedies in life is if you don't reach your own potential and you don't give your essential gifts back to the world, That's a very painful issue. We talk about doing shadow work is dealing with the kind of the repressed, painful stuff that consciously we didn't want to deal with. And that can be for good reasons. It's too painful at that time, but eventually we have to account for this stuff. Well, there's also the light shadows, the gifts, the callings, the vocations that if we don't bring forth, it leads to depression, cynicism, disconnectedness from the world. We don't feel we're stakeholders in what's going on around us. We just feel overwhelmed, and it's not good. So you have to, not only do you have to take care of that, but you have to find out what you're supposed to be doing and what your gifts are. And it can be, it can be a big public, in Christian terms, a ministry or calling, or it can be, just being a good grandmother or a good father or something like that, because all the goodness that we bring to the world reverberates out, and in the Bible it says that the sins of the father would be visited on the children for 7 generations. And I think the Sufis say something like that also, but they also say the good things that we do will affect 7 generations down the line. So that's like, oh, you mean it's not just about me? Yeah, exactly. So
I really like the section in your book where you say that people get to a certain point. I mean, first there's I guess an acceptance of the situation. And for alcoholics, of course, it's hitting bottom. It's realizing this is it. But in every illness, there's a coming to terms with what it is and what your circumstances are. And then that's when you can begin to create a new life, a new way of seeing. And then, as you said, when people get to the higher levels of dealing with these problems, it becomes more about what can I give. And I just thought that was a beautiful part of the book. And I think often people with illness don't feel they've got a lot to give. So they can't do very much. And they often feel like, I've heard people say, I don't want to be a taker. I'm always a taker. I don't, how can I give, and what is there that I have to give? So what do you tell people in that circumstance when they're at rock bottom and feel like there's nothing that they have to give?
Well, first of all, I know exactly. I mean, I've totally been there myself. I understand that. And it can be, it can be a new beginning. It's pathology is path. You can't necessarily deal, or change the karmic cards we're being dealt, right? But you can learn from, what was I doing, or what are the lessons that I learned through my heart attack? There was a lot of internal stuff that I did learn, and take account for that. But basically, you just have to take responsibility for your life and where you're at. And if you're doing that on a merely kind of an egoic existential level, I mean, there's very noble and brave, stoicism and stuff like that can be brought to these things. But if you have the capacity to develop a deeper spiritual connection to ground of being, to essential nature, where you get into those places of non-duality. In other words, where in the process, your little John self, and you go through these. For me, it's kind of like an archaeological dig. I go through different layers of stuff, and when you finally get down to the deepest level, it's just like the boundaries of the ego just kind of go away, and it's like, oh yeah, here I am, home, right? This is what I've always been, am, and always will be at the deepest level, and it's not like in time, like, listening to angels play harps for eternity. God, what a hell that would be, huh? Sick of harp music. No disrespect to harp. It could be electric guitars and it would still be annoying. But time is a dimension that actually comes out of the deep self. The self doesn't exist in time. Time is something that comes out of the self. So you get down to that timeless, eternal place, and that kind of transluces our whole being, so that we come back into our individuated self and whatever's going on, whether being super successful or struggling with a disease, or having to deal with addiction. And we're kind of like, okay, there's a deeper process here. And if my little individual self goes poof, I'm still what I am and always will be. Like it says, like God said to Moses allegedly on Mount Sinai, I am that I am. And in the Hindu tradition, they say that Atman is Brahman, right? Is that the deepest part of the human individual. And this goes back to the earliest scriptures that we know, to the Vedic writings written down, 5,000 years ago, a long time before the Old Testament, any of this stuff. And they said that the deepest part of you, Atman, is none other than Brahman. All right. Mm-hmm. The creator of all universes. I mean, God, that all, if you can use the G word without flinching. A lot of us have problems because we've had, religious, suffering and painful experience with religion. But find a rose by any other name. Find another name that you're comfortable with, and I'm pretty comfortable with however people want to describe that. But when you get in touch with that depth work, then it's like you can just look open-eyed and open-hearted into whatever's going on, and at that point, we begin to tap into, with the contemplative practice. And if you can't do a lot of stuff, hey, what a great opportunity to take up meditation, so meditate 3 or 4 hours a day and become enlightened, if you will, or, wake up and develop your spiritual capacity that you can. And some of the stuff you can't do, just focus on what you can. And we get in touch with the kind of the wisdom self or the wisdom voice, and where it's not something that you figure out intellectually in a linear way. It's just kind of this internal knowing that comes up that can be very, very strong and very definitive, and lets you know about that. And one time when I was dealing with some of the deeper existential issues, like I'm going to die, and everybody I love is going to die. It's like that's a heck of a reality. Well, and so I just put out that question in my meditation, and at this point, I call it prayetation or something like that. It's like meditation prepares me for prayer, and prayer is not oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? It's not that kind of thing, but it's just resting in the presence of that great mystery, just being in that presence, and at that deep kind of soulful level. And for me, the soul is like the deepest part of the individual human comes together with the eternal and the everything. And from that place, I think that's what seems to emerge, this wisdom voice. And the voice that said about death, it says, God or whoever that presence was said, I'll be there. Okay. And it was like, oh, that was enough. I didn't think, well, what are you going to show up? Are you going to look like a wolf or an eagle? What's going to happen? That was enough. To know that God is present in all things, and spiritual practice is going back to the 12 steps. My favorite one, step 11 says, sought through prayer and meditation to increase our conscious contact with God, seeking only His will and the power to carry that out. Now, I know that's very masculine. It's also very G-ish, Godish. And if we're talking to Buddhists or people that don't believe in God, that's okay. You can be totally, deeply spiritual, even enlightened, and have nothing to do with God, as it's often interpreted. So, but that deep place is there, and that wisdom is there. And it is who we are at the deepest level. And at that place, it connects us to everyone, okay? It connects us to... we are Donald Trump sort of experience, like, deal with it, So, so the other part of this that I would say that's really important is to cultivate a deep spiritual practice, where you go into these deepest levels, because that's where we find it. And George Fox was the founder of the Quakers, who I have deep respect for. And if there were Quakers around here, I'd probably join it. But I used to go to them in Berkeley when I was going through a deeply green, when I didn't think there were any smart white people on the planet at that point. I went to the Berkeley Quaker meeting, and I found, as a matter of fact, there's some really great white folks. And anyway, they have a deeply mystical, contemplative. They've always been on the right side of just about everything. Women's rights, the abolition, doing away with fighting slavery, from the blah blah blah. There's this very brilliant, sweet, humble, good folks. But anyway, their founder said that God is an eternal ocean of love and light. And that's kind of really what it feels like. I love that descriptive metaphor. And when you go down to that place, that all your suffering, okay, it's just like an endless ocean of love. It just can just go away. And not only your suffering, but the suffering of all beings, past, present, future, all universes, eternal ocean of light and love. And that's one of the things that we cultivate with a deep practice.
I think a lot of people, particularly ill people who have many avenues cut off for them, could see this as a direction. But a lot of times, how do I get there? What do I do? And I noticed that in your book, you have 4 aspects of spiritual practice. And I wonder if we could talk about them. You say essence, the spiral of development, states of consciousness, and shadow. Yeah. So could we take a moment and look for that?
Which one do you want me to start with?
Well, let's start with essence. I mean, that's you've been talking about that a little bit, I think. So
Right.
let's move from there and talk about essence first.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically finding out who and what you really are. You know,
Hmm.
what was your original face before the Big Bang? Or we kind of updated the koan from the Zinnies. You know, what was your original face before your parents were born? You know,
Yeah.
it's like, what were you before this whole universe 13.8 billion years ago went poof, and there was hydrogen gas, and then and here we are. On the internet talking about practice and recovery from diseases. And when you get down to it, 13.8 billion years ago, I mean, you might think that's a long time, but cosmically, it's a definitely finite amount. I mean, before they thought the universe was eternal, it'd always been here, and it hadn't. Came in and really interesting things started happening. Right, hydrogen gas, nothing, and odorless, tasteless gas swirling into galaxies and star systems and planets and sentient beings. Wow, there's a story there. So you get in touch with that original face, your essence, ground of being, who you are, Godhead, spirit, great mystery, Allah, however you want to put that. And that is and that's not just an intellectual idea. I mean, it can start that way. And it's nice to have theology and study about all this stuff. But it's an actual experience that we begin to relax into. We begin to stabilize it.
And we can find that through the question, who am I?
Yeah.
And I love these shows about cosmology. I think they expand you just to watch them and to see where we've come from and what it's all about and who we are, this tiny speck in the midst of this giant world. So yeah, so meditation and your brainwave programs help people move into that more quickly.
Much more quickly. And the problem with traditional meditation is most of us just don't have the stick-to-itiveness to do it. It takes a long, long time. And you need to have really good teachers to teach you how to do it. And if you're suffering from, some kind of chronic disability, I don't know, if you're mobility or this or that and the other, it's kind of hard to get around and do that. But if you have something that these technologies take you immediately into these very low meditative brainwave states in a few minutes. And if you work with that on an ongoing basis, and then you have a little, some techniques to use, meditative techniques, and pretty soon the practice takes over, and the practice begins to teach you how to practice. You establish the practice, and the practice establishes you, if you will. So that's tremendously important. And I think the next thing you said, states of consciousness.
Well, yes, that was states of consciousness. So
okay. Did I miss levels? Yeah. I was writing a book. I was writing about stages before this conversation. And, but just let's talk about states of consciousness. States of consciousness are states of experience that we experience from moment to moment. Whether it's dreaming, deep sleep, I'm happy, I'm tired, I'm bored, I'm feeling despair, suffering, I'm sexually excited, I'm sexually turned off, and whatever it might be. I'm angry, I'm happy, everything. And one thing that we know about states is that they come and they go. All right. In depression now, often you think this is it. This is the ultimate trip. And that's why we kill ourselves, because we think we're stuck in this state that will last forever. The first thing depressed people need to know is it's not forever. It's like, you go into a storm or a cloud system with an airplane, and, it's like you come out. Don't think that it lasts forever. So all these states are, and they have their functions. And if we learn how to deal with them skillfully, then they become tools for growth and not our masters, where we're constantly trying to change and create new states or avoid certain states and cultivate other states, which can lead to addiction or all kinds of strange behaviors that can become addictive and compulsive. So what we cultivate in meditation is the state beyond all states, the pure spaciousness and awareness that everything arises in from moment to moment.
And that kind of takes us back to what you said at the beginning about making it into an object. Instead of being lost in this state and having no way out, we step back from it and we have the state, whatever it might be. Or we step back into this meditative place from which we can see all states.
and I can't say like I'm 100% perfect with this, but I'm definitely a lot better than I was, and I don't get stuck in it as long. I'm much more resilient. I'll go into it, and instead of being stuck in depression for months, it'll be 2 or 3 hours, or 6 hours or something like that until I do the process. So, and then you keep deepening, and when you get into meditation, you can, within a time you stop your thinking and just be present, and there can be a type of meditation where you stop your thinking and there's just kind of this dullness, but when you're actually awake, there's just this complete awareness. And they talk about emptiness. Emptiness is just pure awareness, and it's what everything emerges from. And when you can do that, and you can kind of observe objectively and watch the states mindfully, what's going on in your body, what are the thoughts, and this, that, and the other, same time maintaining the spaciousness, then it gives us a place of deep peace and centeredness, which deal with stuff that comes and goes. It comes and goes, and some things take us a while to get through. But the more that we can tap into that openness and spaciousness, which is really cultivated in meditation and quite quickly using these new technologies that we have, you can learn to work with states that come and go and totally experience. And there's a teaching story heard one time where it's the Buddha's students, okay, and the Buddha dies, his physical body goes ciao, right? And so the new students are all just really weeping, just grieving, and the intermediate students are very starving. And the advanced students are all weeping like they, so yeah, you can go to this kind of dissociative, the Buddha don't feel nothing, right? To where you can totally feel and embrace your humanity and all that means, the grieving, the pain, the joy, the exaltation, all of the stuff, but do it from a place of a much larger expanded context. And what happens is when we begin to deal with our own grief and our own suffering, that it begins to cultivate compassion. In other words, for other people, that we can deal more fully and more open-heartedly and compassionately with other people's pain. And all your spiritual practice, and all this stuff, enlightenment and blah, 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 if that doesn't include increased love and compassion, then it's just to my humble or not so humble opinion, it's just a big head trip, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. So there has to be compassion, and it makes us humbler. It makes us more accepting of others, accepting of ourselves, and we become better people.
And I think that moves us into the third. We've talked about essence, getting in touch with our essence. We've talked about cultivating spiritual states, and then you also mentioned shadow, which is something to also clear out, so that we have the capacity to discover essence, and we have the capacity to cultivate space. So maybe you could say a little bit about shadow.
Yeah, and shadow are just the unconscious, semi-unconscious, painful areas. I mean, you can know about them perhaps intellectually, like something really bad happened to me when I was a kid, but I don't want to open door number 3 because I don't want to let that stuff out. And that makes total intuitive sense. I mean, why the hell would you want to go back and deal with that stuff unless you knew that you had to, in other words, to get well. And what happens is when we split these pieces off for ourselves, either consciously or unconsciously, they don't, stick them in the dungeon or lock them up in the closet or whatever. They don't go away. They come out in really bad ways. They grow up in the living room or the front yard, and they cause, really bad stuff to happen. It can be somatic, it can be diseases, it can be cancer, it can be heart disease, it can be depression. In the case of sexual things, if you don't deal with it, you can become a pedophile. Most pedophiles that I know, and I have known some, and being a counselor and the work that I've done in the world, invariably they were abused as children. That's how that particular thing got started. And that's why it's such a crime to do that to a child. And or if you were, sexually abused or something, like, often you'll just keep repeating that trauma and acting out and promiscuously and sexual ways that aren't good for you or anybody, And so you have to actually go back and let those things come up. And what I found in trauma and shadow work is that it has to be a somatic process. In other words, it has to be released through the body. It can't be just an intellectual realization. Oh, this is what happened to me, therefore I'm doing this. Yikes. I mean, that's good. That's not bad, but that doesn't heal you necessarily. Can it just make it worse if you don't have the real energetic somatic release? And I found that out in my own working with my own depression when I started using this technology. And I think that's one of the benefits of this technology, the brain entrainment stuff, is that it actually gets to some things that traditional meditation often doesn't, because often, you'll just see it, but it'll be kind of dissociative. You'll see the issues. And that's why I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Enneagram, but often our beloved fives, they think it's really easy to get to enlightenment. They dissociate from everything and they think that's a story. No, you really have to. It's not dissociating. It kind of is, but then you have to own it. In other words, you deconstruct, deconstruct, and it's a complete acceptance of all things with love. And if you can get down to the place in your meditation where you just like, thank you, I love the disease, and give it total welcoming, thank you, teacher, and acceptance. Boy, that is a hugely important thing to get to. And at that point, in these states of deep relaxation that happens in meditation, and you can kind of consciously do it. One of my prayers when I'm meditating is, okay, God, and I have a history with religions and stuff, and I've done some healing, so I can use the G word without, So anyway, just in my head, I said, God, if there's anything that I need to be dealing with, looking at, releasing, doing, and if I missed a category, let me know, because, you're God, right? So, and in that deep, relaxed place, then things will come up. It's like this resentment about this person or this bad thing that you did unconsciously, or consciously, but working out your unconscious that you need to go clean up, or the book you need to write, or the path that you're on in your life, or what to do about your child, or whatever it is, that'll come up. To include the painful stuff. And the painful stuff, when it comes up and you're looking at it, something really bad happened, the mental chatter around it's like, oh, this is your fault, or this is too heavy. If you go into this door, you'll get stuck in there forever and you'll never come out and you'll be damaged. And it's like, thank you for sharing. You kind of bracket it over here, and then you just stay with the somatic issues, the pain in your heart. Usually it's right in my solar plexus of my heart where most of my stuff happens, and it often intensify, and then it will begin to release. And when it's released, it's when you feel, wow, I feel clear, I feel good. Peace, and I'm back. And oftentimes there's a lot of energy that's also released, psychic energy, spiritual energy, emotional energy, because it takes a lot of energy just to keep all that stuff out of awareness. You have to build these cages, or these.
So you're saying, meditation, and we read this often in integral theory, is not going to solve your shadow issues. You have to bring it, as you say, into the body. And in your book, you also mentioned a couple of other techniques. We probably don't have time today to go into them, but you mentioned the 3-2-1 process, which is a way of finding some of those issues and actually bringing them closer and closer to you so that you can feel them. And you also mentioned the Sedona method, which some people may be familiar with. And there are a number of methods out there, but that's the sort of thing you need to do. Just sitting and saying, I have it, as you said, from your head isn't not enough. You have to actually work with this shadow. And so for people with illness who often have maltreatment just because they're ill, people who've been ill a long time have often been discounted, disempowered, overlooked, and there's a lot of resentment and misery, grief that can build up for someone with illness. So the shadow aspect is a really important
of the patient, the person suffering from the disease, and also maybe even more important, the caregivers. Because if not, they'll just, how can you be with somebody in a responsible, loving, wise way if you haven't done your own work, and work on your own.
True. That's so true. It's so
renew
easy.
Yourself.
Yeah.
Because you go to like an addiction centers and stuff, and you're dealing with all these constant awful stories and pain and suffering and broken families and abuse and criminality and blah, blah, broken dreams. And if you don't have a practice where you get into your deepest parts of yourself and get that renewal that comes from a deep spiritual practice, a contemplative practice, then you're just going to burn out. And once you're burnt out, you're really useless to help others. You're just adding to the problem and to the suffering. So that has to be, taken care of.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, from the caregiver perspective here, it's been essential. It's been essential for me. And I also have found, oddly enough, that being with a person who is suffering, being with pain, can be a spiritual path in itself. But again, it needs all of those things. Get in touch with essence, work on states of consciousness, work on your shadow. And then there's the fourth one that you mentioned. We don't have a lot of time, and it's a very complicated issue, but I wonder if we could just touch on it, which is the spiral of development.
Yeah. So it's really important to know that not only we're, I'm writing a book now. It's called The Life of Practice. So all this stuff has to be worked on a daily basis. Oh my God. But that's a lot, but so what? Whoever said that achieving these your extraordinary potential as a human being is easy? Mm-hmm. If you want the easy way out, go watch television and take the right pill and that'll fix it. I mean, it takes heroic effort, but it's also very inspiring because, we're drawn out of where we are and we're starting to become what we can be. So we need that essence being, but we also need becoming the best level of ourselves. And as individual human beings, one of the most important things, if not the most important, is like remembering who we are and accomplishing and doing what we need to be doing in this lifetime. And if we don't do that, it's just painful. We're not authentically happy. We don't reach it. So at developmental levels, I'll give you the real fast version. You start out egocentric, and there's stuff below egocentric, but let's just start at egocentric. What does an egocentric person care about? Numero uno, right? It's all about them. And if you've ever had the pleasure of living or being around or being in a relationship with a narcissist, or if you are a narcissist, you realize it's really limited, and it's like, if it's not about you, it doesn't matter. Okay. So beyond that, we have what we call ethnocentric, which was where you expand beyond self-care to the care of your identified group, whether it's, your co-religionists or your people from your country or the people from your, ethnic group, or however, your football team, however you do that, you care about your group and you don't care about the other group. So if you're your average, from what we see, a Sunni Muslim, and the guy's a Shia over there, you're not going to like this guy. You probably want to, really treat him poorly and not kill him, right? So that's old stuff. And from the outside, they go, they're Muslim. They look like the same to me. The same pray God, same book and everything. And of course, we've done that. We did that for hundreds of years with our Catholicism and Protestant issues, right? We slaughtered each other for centuries in Europe, and right up to the near I was just in Belfast a few weeks ago, and they were blowing each other up and slaughtering each other till just a few years ago, and finally they went, okay, enough of this. And they, from what I can say, they really don't like each other still very much in general, but they tolerate each other, and toleration is a great step towards reconciliation. So so then you have ethnocentric, and in healthy development, you include the prior level. In other words, though you care about your family, your group, that's a really leap in ethnic and moral stance, but you still can, in healthy development, you still care about yourself, okay? Take self-care, group care, and beyond that becomes world-centric, which is where you realize, you look at the whole thing, it's like, hey, there's so much more that connects us than divides us. We are all human beings, and if we're going to have any kind of justice or any lasting peace in this world, we're going to have to figure out how to make it work for all of us. Win, 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 win. And realizing you have this whole world that's coming from different developmental levels who see the world completely in different terms. So that's why we have, the second tier integral stuff, which I don't have time to get into, I'm sure, that allows us to start seeing, hey, all of these things are pieces of the puzzle. We all start at grade one. We start at the beginning and we work our way up to the highest as we can. It usually helps us to get to the level that our particular culture is at. So if you're at ethnocentric culture, you can get there pretty easily because there's all kinds of support. But if you want to go beyond that, it gets kind of pioneering. And beyond that, we have a cosmocentric, and that means just the care of the whole universe, everything, the water, the beast, all sentient beings, the earth, all beings, everything, is all part of it. And our concern expands. So there's this growth level of growing compassion and concern and skillfulness. There's new capacities in a healthy developmental level. And under stressful conditions such as addiction, you go bibbity bop bit dop doom dop dink down to the to the lower and lower levels. And you can kind of see that going on in our political spectrum or political happenings in the world right now, that there's a lot of fear of immigration in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, and economic insecurities. And that has led to the rise of dictators, of far right-wing philosophies. The Nazis are coming back, and look what's going on in our country. And so under fear and stress, we can do one or two things. We can evolve to higher levels, or we can devolve. So that's important. And I think the practice, and we're talking about chronic diseases, if you don't have this kind of understanding of this landscape we're talking about, and the practices to deal with the suffering and the stress and all this stuff, you can actually just devolve into a higher level, or it can be the path to waking up and becoming the deepest, best version of yourself and connecting with all things.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I think the fact that we know that we can evolve, that the state of consciousness we're in right now, the way we see the world, and we run up against what are often called disorienting dilemmas. And illness can be a very disorienting dilemma. And how we are able to relate to that is going to have a lot to say about how our life looks in the future. If we can relate to that and continue to hold that disorienting dilemma until we realize there are higher ways to look at it, more expanded ways, and we'll develop ourselves. And the more we develop ourselves, the more options we have. The more options we have for treating illness, the more options we have for creating good relationships and all those kinds of things. So to me, when I discovered this map of evolution, this idea that we're not done at 21, that we just continue to grow and develop ourselves, that's just such an exciting concept. And again, all of these things that we've been talking about today are completely open to somebody with illness. They don't require you to get out there and do something. You don't have to succeed. You don't have to be physically strong. You can do all of this right where you are. And in fact, sometimes people with illness are even uniquely suited because they have this disorienting dilemma. They cannot run away. When you have your heart attack, you cannot run away from the need to look at all four quadrants. You can't run away from spirituality. It's right in your face. And I think that's actually, in an odd way, a gift that being around people with illness, I see how much they can grow and deepen. That many people with illness that I've known are some of the deepest people that I've met. So applying all these things that you've been talking about, so important.
And in my work with, initially with my depression and stuff, one of my practices is when I was meditating and the stuff that's come up, this darkness, this suffering, this despair, resentment, anger, whatever it was, I would say, thank you, teacher, and just embrace it and just be with it. And I love you too. And just total acceptance and taking total responsibility. So even if you're bedridden or you can't get around anymore, if you continue to develop your spirituality, your depth and your essence and who you are with the potential that you've given, with the cards you've been dealt, you can change things for generations to come. You remember Grandma? She was going through. She was amazing. She was so loving and so wise. Even when she, when she's in this condition, it's just extraordinary. And that's just a blessing that's going out to your children's children and their friends and their influences. So when a person wakes up and deepens into this realization through practice, and there's just no way to get there stably, healthily, without practice. I know an integral practice, because you have to include everything that needs to be included, or you're going to miss a big piece. Like if you just go for the light, right? And you just want to be with God, and it calls spiritual bypassing, and you don't want to deal with the shadow and the dark and the pain and the suffering, it's just going to end up in a pathological mess. You have to take both. You have to take the light and the darkness, and it becomes one. And that's where it really comes together, and it becomes wisdom, and it becomes compassion. And it's not just something phony and something dissociated and a weird cult or whatever it develops into. So
Yeah, I think you've opened a lot of doors today. I think, I'm putting on this course series, which attempts to bring all of these different aspects of integral theory in to help people with chronic illness. And so I think it is such a broad picture that the more people can learn about this and the more they can practice in all of these different areas, the richer their life is going to be. And I recommend John's book, whether you have alcoholism or addiction in your world or not. I think it's a fabulous introduction to integral, and you can apply that, the lessons in there to illness as well. So information about how to access John's book and access him will be attached to this interview. So
Yeah.
you'll be able to find it.
Awesome.
Yeah. So
Thank
any
you so
last
much,
word,
man.
John?
Yeah, my current book, as I said, is, I don't know if I said it, but I'll say it again. It's called the Life of Practice: Taking Evolution Personally. And it was very clear when I was writing the first book. It's not just for addicts or people suffering from disease or this or that. It's like it's for everyone.
Yeah.
We all need to do the same essential things, and we do it according to our capacities. But we all have to wake up. We all have to grow up, show up, clean up. And if you want and that's one of the frameworks that I'm using in this book. And if you want, what is the meaning of life? Oh, there it is. Wake up, remember who and what you are, always have been, grow up, get to the highest level of your own personal capacities and morality and ethics. Why? Because at these higher levels, we can really begin to deal with all the issues that are created at the lower levels that we just can't get out of. And then you have to clean up, and then do your personal work, whether it's cleaning up your body and your diet and dealing with your issues, your bad stories, your traumas, your shadows. And then you have to show up. So you do all this work, then you have to get back to the world. You have to go back into the marketplace, going back into humanity, into the world with an open mind and an open heart, and give.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Beautifully said. Well, thank you, John, very much. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks for having me.